We've talked a lot about bosses at this point, and I understand that this is a very large section of an already massive critique, so real quick, I'd just like to acknowledge all of you watching up to this point and say I truly appreciate each and every one of you who've managed to make it this far, especially the Elden Ring fans. I've never been one to shy away from the occasional dig at the elitist douchebags of the community because I've been actively involved in the FromSoft community since the days of the first Dark Souls, so I hope you can understand how a decade and a half of hearing the particularly insufferable corner of the community repeat the same tired get-good arguments has led me to feeling somewhat sour regarding the player base.
That's why I make fun of the guys who sound like this.
And Lord knows there is no shortage of people unironically still making those comments on my channel. That being said, this game in particular, as well as From games in general, has a massive player base and is full of perfectly likable people who love this game. And I don't want any of you who genuinely like the game and can express that respectfully to come out of this feeling as if I'm just ragging on you or the game you love. I care very much about being as fair to this game as can be afforded. There's a reason that the first almost hour of this boss critique started with bosses I really enjoyed for the most part. However, I also find it to be an extremely flawed game, and I've honestly been baffled by the universal acclaim it's received, hence my wanting to make this critique in the first place. I understand that I am very much in the minority when it comes to this game. I honestly thought I was starting to go crazy when I heard so many people calling it one of the greatest video games ever made, and even now I'm still not seeing it. But no, I have dedicated far more hours of my life than I would have liked playing this game ad nauseum, and I have a lot to say. I apologize if I come off as harsh, and I don't mean to discourage anybody. You are free to like this game all you want. Hell, I kind of like the game, or at least parts of it, but I simply find far too much of it to be a fault to even consider it one of the greatest games of all time, let alone a particularly great game. That's why I made this critique to begin with. I hope that doesn't seem like a pointless tangent. I just wanted to show a sincere appreciation for people who genuinely like or love this game and have managed to make it this far in a critique, pretty much tearing the game to shreds without making an ass of themselves in the comments. For now, I'm gonna start by ripping apart the fan favorite, Maliketh, the Black Blade.
Oh, death. Become my blade once more.
Maliketh is a boss that I dislike for a multitude of reasons, so let's start with the most immediately obvious design choice before we get into the real meat and potatoes of this thing, that being the visual design. I know I have a whole section dedicated to the game's artistic direction, but I can't not talk about this. I understand this critique has been very much full of hot takes, but I want to at least acknowledge that what I'm about to say is extremely subjective, and I realize that I am in the minority on Maliketh's design. However, I still think it's worth discussing nonetheless. Maliketh's visual design makes it very difficult for me to take him remotely seriously. I'm sure I just triggered a hell of a lot of people by saying this, but
give me a moment to explain!
I completely understand, sincerely, why anyone would like Maliketh's visual design, but for me, it comes off as a very try-hard attempt to emulate the aesthetics of several beloved and, in my opinion, far superior bosses. Maliketh is fanservice cranked to 11. His hair is an obvious throwback to the Nameless King. His sword utilizes energy waves akin to Ludwig but with a color inversion. His armor looks like a sort of blend between that of the Artorias and Nameless King armor sets. And naturally, he is a monstrous wolf that we had to travel through time to in order to face so we can reach a pitch black natural born evil that the gods themselves tremble in fear of. Yeah, does that sound familiar? Oh, but the fan service doesn't stop there. Maliketh's Phase 2 cutscene is utterly caked in cinematography reminiscent of Ludwig and Artorias' respective boss cutscenes. We get the shot of him kneeling as he just sort of quietly ponders what to do next before building to Ludwig's iconic Phase 2 shot, except this time it's inverted with the sword pointing down. And we even get the stretched, wolf-like stance of Artorias. They really went all out with the fan service here. I don't blame anyone for thinking that Maliketh looks absolutely badass. However, to me, he comes off as a very try-hard attempt at hollow fan service and more closely resembles an edgy Berserk Souls OC than he does any of the iconic bosses that his design is trying to emulate. Look, I'm sorry, but to me it just looks like middle school Miyazaki's edgy Berserk OC. Please don't steal. I feel like Maliketh belongs in Code Vein more than he does Elden Ring. At least the try-hard fan service would suit that game, but even still, his design is just... It's so over the top. But hey, look, even if a boss's visual design was a complete train wreck, what really matters is how well it plays. Unfortunately, FromSoft completely jumped the shark with this one, and the boss fight is one of the most insufferable in the entire game. But let's be fair and start with the Beast Clergyman, Maliketh's first phase. The Beast Clergyman is yet another hyper-aggressive and large boss with attacks that often come so fast you'd be forgiven for thinking that he's animation canceling. His projectiles are also quite fast and even possess lingering hitboxes, and naturally, he also comes equipped with an AoE that triggers 3 consecutive times, because of course they do. It was around this point in my playthrough where it felt like From had all but given up and dropped all pretenses of trying to craft a truly distinct boss and decided that every quote-unquote hard Elden Ring boss was just gonna have the exact same abilities, just with different animations. He's just another large enemy jumping around and dishing out rapid attacks and AoEs. There's nothing to distinguish this first phase from really anything else in the game, mechanically speaking. It's just... more Elden Ring.
Loveless, you just don't want to have to learn all the boss's movesets.
What's to learn? They all have the exact same abilities, just with different animations. But the issue isn't just that he has a bloated and overtuned moveset. The Beast Clergyman is also fast, and I mean very fast. He can dish out multiple attacks and back off in less than a third of the time it would take for the player to do the exact same thing, even with the most agile of builds, and unlike the player, Maliketh isn't restrained by a stamina bar. This means that the only real strategy is to either try and maintain a distance and hurl projectiles at him, or nail him with a single attack between his own combos, which is pretty much the exact same strategy as every other boss in this game. However, the fight completely lacks the rhythm of bosses like Godfrey and Loretta, making for an awkward back and forth that often results in stilted hit trading more so than a fluent exchange of attacks. Hit trading on its own isn't a problem, but you have to remember that this is Elden Ring's late game, meaning the Beast Clergyman will deal a lot of damage with even his most basic attack. This is only the first phase, basically the part that FromSoft doesn't even care about. Already the boss has a notably overtuned moveset and a staggering combination of both speed and raw power. So what the hell could the second phase possibly? Yeah, so remember that little talk we had about fan service? Hard as it might be to believe, I don't find it especially interesting that Maliketh does the Artorias jumps, or the Gale flips, or the Ludwig energy waves. Nor am I a particular fan of the gravity-defying anime wombo combos, where I can actually perceive his character model turning on the axis as his tracking ensures a complete impossibility of him attacking in the wrong direction. Furthermore, it's often more difficult to tell just what the fuck is even happening than anything else, especially when he's utilizing these hyper-animated energy attacks that clutter the screen with so many moving particle effects, clogging the player's vision and working overtime on trying to induce a fucking migraine. Anyone else remember when Souls games were supposed to be these semi-grounded role-playing games? Sure, Sekiro was fairly over the top at times, but even it didn't have the guardian ape doing Code Vein acrobatics as if he was trying to get signed on with All Elite Wrestling. I'm sorry, but this shit just looks ridiculous to me, especially with the blatantly hypertuned tracking. More importantly, however, much as is the problem with most of Elden Ring's bosses, it turns the boss into a test of patience and memorization rather than a test of learning and genuine skill. Maliketh is unquestionably amongst Elden Ring's most aggressive and mobile bosses, and downtime between his attacks is so horrendously slim that there's really only a single attack with a relatively risk-free punish window. The heavy sword slam which he uses as a combo finisher leaves him open for a fair couple of seconds, and that's very much appreciated after what is likely going to be a very lengthy period of time spent watching him and trying to dodge his onslaught of ridiculously far-reaching attack chains that see him flying around the arena like a wannabe Devil May Cry character. I find this kind of boss fight asinine to sit through, and if you're like me and suffer from an attention deficit while also being just fed up with Elden Ring's typical enemy and boss design by this point in the game, you'll likely opt to explore far riskier methods of play so as to try and make things remotely engaging, let alone challenging. And this is where Maliketh really begins to fall apart, because no matter how fast you are, Maliketh is faster, and trading hits with him is far from a worthwhile option because of just how absurdly punishing he can be. Sure, Maliketh's health bar isn't nearly as bad as enemies like the Fire Giant or the Elden Beast, in fact it's surprisingly low for this point in the game, but that is a sorry excuse of a counterbalance to the utterly insane punishment that he is capable of executing. Maliketh's damage is downright ludicrous, and this is coming from a boss that attacks with extreme speed on top of being incredibly agile to the point that he's actually difficult to keep track of at times. Furthermore, his attacks cause a debuff called Destined Death because I guess he wasn't edgy enough on his own. For God's sake, Spawn and Shadow are cringing with secondhand embarrassment. No, but seriously, this debuff is fucking stupid, and not just on Maliketh, okay? Maliketh's Black Blade and the Black Blade incantation are downright busted against the vast majority of this game's enemies. Destined Death is a debuff that reduces the player's maximum health while also dealing damage over time, and holy shit, look at it go! I'd like to remind you that Maliketh's attacks already deal outrageous damage and will rip through any attempts to block them, meaning that the player quite literally has no choice but to dodge the majority of his attacks, that or use the Blasphemous Claw, but we'll get to that soon enough. Furthermore, if Maliketh is in the middle of a combo, which is pretty much what will be happening for 90% of the fight, it will be literally impossible not to die if you are hit even once because you won't even have the time to get off a safe heal. Hell, sometimes it doesn't even matter if he's still on the offense. Sometimes you literally cannot get up and heal fast enough even if you are mashing the button as desperately as possible. Do I seriously need to explain why it is that applying very fast damage over time and reducing the player's maximum health is bullshit to use, in conjunction with nigh unblockable attacks that already deal ridiculously high damage and are executed with similarly high speed while also possessing enormous area coverage over an arena that isn't too large to begin with and is surrounded by a death pit that the boss is completely unaffected by? I really hope not. Further adding to this already insane degree of offense is the fact that Maliketh's sword is so damn long it will actually hit you through the noticeably large pieces of the environment that you might once have thought to provide you cover. This reminds me of how Morgott couldn't be kicked over the cliff. You're seriously telling me that they couldn't even bother to make Maliketh's sword bounce off of these things? I mean, if you didn't want Maliketh being blocked by them, why not just make them destructible? That would at least validate him being able to attack through them at a visual level, and hey, it would have made the dude look a lot more imposing, but as it stands, you can just get clipped through an indestructible part of the environment. Why? On top of that, his ridiculous area coverage ensures that even if you successfully dodge his diving sword spin, you are still very likely to be clipped by the second spin. Bear in mind, he will often do this attack after hurling multiple high damaging projectiles at you, which also, of course, apply Destined Death. If you're hit by even one of these, you will not survive unless you find yourself miraculously lucky enough for the second spin not to connect, because you will not have the time to heal between these attacks, and the Destined Death will basically guarantee your death even if you somehow manage to survive 2 of his attacks in a row. That is ridiculous.
Oh come on, Loveless, you just want enemies to be tuned for level 30 vigor and have no other defensive options. Just equip the Dragon Crest +2 and level your vigor to 99 and put on the Radagon's armor and equip Morgoth's Great Rune.
Hey, here's an idea. How about you level up your fucking listening comprehension and then get back to me? Then there's all the AoEs, one of which might very well possess the single most inaccurate and consistently wonky hitbox I think I've ever seen from this studio, at least since Dark Souls 2. To this day, I legitimately have no idea how the fuck it is you are supposed to dodge this particular AoE because I have tried everything, and the only thing that I can think consistently works would be Bloodhound Step because yeah, of course it does. Dodging forward, dodging to the side, dodging away, running forward, running to the side, running away. There is not a thing in the player's base moveset that can be utilized to escape this thing without already being in the proper position to avoid it. No AoE that deals this much damage and applies a debuff as busted as Destined Death should ever be this difficult to avoid. It is complete bullshit.
Sounds like a skill issue, Loveless.
You know what? I completely agree. FromSoft didn't apply any of their skill to designing this thing, did they?
Loveless, just Google how to dodge it.
Yeah, you know, I'm kind of tired of having to do that with bosses. Don't you think that's a little fucking stupid? Then there's the Blasphemous Claw, an item found in Far Missoula if you're lucky enough to have completed the questline that will spawn the NPC that appears with it. By the way, there's also no indication that they would even be appearing there following the questline, so hey, let's hope you manage to win all those coin tosses, because the Blasphemous Claw can be a serious difference maker with Maliketh. Bear in mind, this questline begins with a character at an obscure shack in Limgrave and doesn't pick up until you reach Volcano Manor. I've already talked about the issues with quest design in Souls games, but in this particular case, this design is now directly bleeding into the difficulty of a mandatory boss. You really need to understand that utilizing the Blasphemous Claw against Maliketh versus not using it is a complete night and day difference. It makes the fight significantly easier because it allows you to parry multiple of his attacks with relative ease. There's no riposte or visceral attack, and you need to be careful to avoid Maliketh's sword as he brings it down, but you're still granted a relatively generous window to either gather your bearings or unleash a counterattack, one which you'll be able to take advantage of likely multiple times, and that is borderline invaluable against a boss with punish windows as paper thin as this one. I'm honestly curious how many players, even just amongst my viewers, don't even know that this mechanic exists, because this has to be one of the most obfuscated pieces of equipment in the entire game. I had played this game multiple times over and had numerous lengthy discussions with friends who love and hate this game, and it wasn't until VG Matt referenced it in his Elden Ring boss critique that I was finally made aware of it. If there was ever proof that Souls questlines need a serious rework, this is it. Also, go check out VG Matt's critique, it's excellent. I understand that this boss is relatively popular amongst Elden Ring fans, likely due to the mix of fan service and that deliciously high difficulty, but unfortunately, whilst they were going out of their way to make Maliketh as blisteringly difficult as possible, FromSoft didn't really seem to have any other priorities. I understand why people often get defensive about these bosses though. The idea that they're flawed can easily undermine the sense of accomplishment that comes with beating such a difficult foe, but you have to understand that being difficult is not synonymous with being well designed, no matter how good it felt to finally overcome that challenge, because that feeling is ultimately completely subjective. I would never want to undermine anyone's sense of accomplishment in overcoming any challenge, no matter what it was, but we have to avoid letting pride and favoritism blind us to objective faults in media that we love. Maliketh is a badly designed boss relative to the game that he is in. I'm sorry if you feel as if me saying that undermines the pride you felt in beating him, but beyond whatever I may think about his appearance or the fan service, he is objectively poorly designed relative to the game that he is in, and the difficulty of this fight is completely artificial. His first phase is a downright bore to face on replay and feels like nothing more than a stepping stone to the real boss fight, because once you put aside his overtuned moves, he is a complete plank of a boss, devoid of anything of note. When it comes to the second phase, despite having an extremely limited moveset compared to those of other bosses, he is downright plagued with issues. Beyond the damage, speed, and mobility, Destined Death has to be one of the most blatantly artificial attempts to inflate a boss's difficulty that I have ever seen, not even just from a Souls game. It is absurd to me that this debuff even exists, and the fact that the player can actually utilize it with similar potency borders on complete and utter lunacy. It practically guarantees the target inflicted with it will die under most circumstances, providing you're being even a little bit aggressive, which Maliketh very much is. Yes, there are other enemies whom also wield Destined Death, but the effects from their attacks are far less potent than Maliketh's and thus feel much more fair and manageable as additional layers to those fights. Electo has a couple of attacks that are basically tuned down versions of Maliketh's, and yeah, they can be annoying, but at least the dodge windows are clear and consistent with him. A graceful spare which is sadly absent with Maliketh. The arena itself has very little of note besides the surrounding death pit, which doesn't even play a role in the fight, and Maliketh can literally attack you through the four structures which are supposed to be indestructible. Combine all of these issues with punish windows that are downright minuscule thanks to the boss's sheer over-aggression, with the most consistent tool for enabling more opportunities to punish being locked behind an obscure quest, and what you ultimately end up with is a poorly designed, poorly realized boss fight. I honestly consider this boss to be a massive stain on this studio's reputation and one of the all-time worst in From's catalog. And because I know somebody is still going to say it, no, the issue is not that he's too hard. The issue is that the balancing is downright abysmal, and it is abundantly clear to me that numerous elements of his design were not very well thought out. The last time I fought Maliketh on stream, I beat him my first try, and I rarely struggle to beat him anymore because the fact is, once you figured him out, Maliketh is not difficult, he is unbalanced. He is an unbalanced train wreck of boss design that honestly leaves me in awe that they would pick this particular boss to be the one that tries to emulate some of the greatest bosses this studio has ever produced. It is painfully ironic. But now it's time to move on from Maliketh the Black Blade to Radagon of the Golden Order. Radagon is a boss that I feel people really only view favorably because it's so immediately followed by the Elden Beast, which, as many of you are likely aware, is kind of, not good, instead of good. But to be perfectly honest, I don't really know what it is that people see in Radagon, because to me, for lack of a better term, he's probably the most unga bunga boss I think I've ever seen, and no, it's not just because of the hammer, hear me out. Radagon's first phase is surprisingly basic, which feels strange given he follows Maliketh and Godfrey. I mean, there's also Sir Gideon, but I mean, come on. His moveset is a fairly straightforward blend of melee and magic, primarily relying on hammer swings and slams with the occasional use of AoE magic, teleports to reposition, projectiles, and that's pretty much it for his first phase. He's really simple. Like, distractingly so. I get that there is more to come, so they probably felt it was necessary to exercise some restraint, but like, I don't know, I don't think he had to be quite this simple. I mean, he's pretty inoffensive, he's not particularly bad or anything, but like, do you have any idea what kind of shit I had to face just to get here? I mean, was this really what all the hype surrounding Marika and Radagon was all about? I know that probably sounds insane coming from me, given I've criticized many of Elden Ring's bosses for having ridiculously over-the-top antics, but like, you can at least understand how I would find this a little bit jarring, right? Of course, there is also his second phase, and this is unfortunately where I feel the problems really begin to surface. So, Radagon's phase 2 is pretty much just his first phase, but with AoE slapped onto almost everything he does, and I really mean almost everything. Even his teleport has AoE damage tacked onto it, and that's pretty much all there is to say about it. I'm really not trying to sound like a reductionist, but that really is all there is to the fight. His melee is pretty easy to read, which I guess is nice, and his AoEs take a bit of getting used to, but once you've figured those things out, you've pretty much automatically won the fight. His second phase really is obnoxious though. It's as if they really couldn't think of anything remotely interesting to do with him, so they just decided, alright, we're gonna put AoEs on basically every one of his attacks. Oh, and the teleport too, Cause why not, you know? His teleport has an AoE, his most basic melee attacks have AoEs, his bolts have AoEs that go off moments after they hit the ground, even his command grab has an AoE that will affect other players and summons. AoE, AoE, EI, fucking O. I guess part of what makes him so tolerable is the fact that he can be staggered and even afflicted with debuffs while also having a fairly standard pool of health. Some of his attacks do have some annoying delays, but they're nothing compared to this game's most notorious offenders. When it comes down to it, once you nail the dodge timings, the fight's a bit of a cakewalk, and a pretty brief one at that. I don't know, this fight is just really low energy, and it's kinda disappointing. Now obviously I'll take this over obnoxious bullshit like Maliketh, but it's important to remember that this fight happens right after Godfrey and is the penultimate fight in the game. Ironically, in a game that never seems to know when to say enough was enough, FromSoft ended up showing perhaps a bit too much restraint with Radagon, likely because they wanted him to be directly linked to the Elden Beast. Full disclosure, it wasn't worth it. I really do wonder what they would have done with Radagon if they had been willing to have it so you didn't have to challenge him again whenever you die to the Elden Beast. Obviously, with this being a back-to-back boss, they had to show some degree of restraint, but it didn't need to be a back-to-back boss in the first place. Why not just have Godfrey, followed by Radagon in his own dedicated fight, which would then be followed by the Elden Beast? Ironically, the Elden Beast might be the reason Radagon himself was so shallow, which is a shame given just how much this fight is hyped up over the course of the game. Radagon and Marika are rightfully treated as very big deals, and this can be picked up on even if you are paying almost no attention whatsoever to the narrative. Marika is literally the reason this world exists as it does, disregarding the greater will and Ronnie anyways, as well as being responsible for every event that unfolds. Radagon is essentially her gender-bent clone who served her and with her birthed many of the most important figures in this game's lore, many of whom we fight. Not only that, but Radagon and Marika are directly linked to the titular Elden Ring and in communion with the greater will, which is basically God. Radagon is a very big deal. Us fighting him is a very big deal. And yet this fight feels as if it's been deprived of all possible life and energy. And I don't mean that in the same regard as Gwen or Alon. Radagon is literally in communion with God. He harbors a direct link to the single greatest power that a person can wield in this realm, barring perhaps the Frenzied Flame, and he is the last line of defense before the very vassal of God itself. For Radagon to be such a bare bones and simple fight amidst an in-game gauntlet of such ridiculously overly designed shovelware like Maliketh, and not to mention all-time classics like Godfrey, is really bizarre to me, and I hope that you can at least understand where I'm coming from with this. He feels like a worse Gwen. I don't understand. But then there's the Elden Beast itself, and oh dear lord, this might just be the single worst final boss fight in any video game that I have ever played. Or at the very least, it is undeniably FromSoft's worst final boss by far. You know, not counting the DLC, that is. For Demon Souls, if we wanted to be as critical as possible and not consider False King Allant the game's true final boss, which, let's be real, it is the very last test of skill the player will face, so by that metric, it is the final boss. But if we disregard that, then the true King Allant at least has the story supporting him. Yeah, he's a defenseless blob, but at least he's not wasting your fucking time, and it does make for a pretty interesting twist. And then there's Dark Souls, which Gwyn might very well have been the perfect final boss to conclude that game with. A bit easy, yeah, sure, but he was a terrific wrap-up to the game's story, and mechanically he was sound, even if he was pretty simple. Like I mentioned, he's similar to Radagon, but at least there is a narrative purpose for being as pathetic as he is, and the twist itself is iconic regardless. The Throne Watcher and Defender, Nashandra and Aldio were dogshit final bosses for a pretty shit game, but at least you could breeze through them in almost no time flat. Whereas the Elden Beast, oh dear god, this thing stalls even more than the Fire Giant. Then there's Gehrman, in my opinion FromSoft's greatest final boss to date, and not to mention the Moon Presence not being a half-bad secret boss either. Both of them serve as fantastic capstones to an outstanding game. Then there's the Soul of Cinder, a similarly exceptional and very close second for me to Gehrman, which I completely understand why anyone would put ahead of Gehrman. Then there's Sekiro's final boss, and while I'm personally not a fan, frankly I just found it kinda boring, but I at least understand why so many would consider it one of From's greatest final bosses. Again, I don't agree with the notion, but I at least respect the fact that people adore it, and I can see why they do. I'm not about to deny that as a story beat, holy shit that was awesome. Elden Beast, however, has no such fanfare to the point that even the most die-hard fans of this game wouldn't even dream of trying to defend this fucking pathetic excuse for a final boss. It is painfully ironic to me when I hear this game being touted as one of the greatest games ever made, or when I recall just how monumentally successful this title was financially, and not to mention critically, as well as the fact that it was as well funded as it was, that the capstone challenge would be such a catastrophic failure. Regardless of whether you love or hate Elden Ring, you cannot seriously deny that the Elden Beast was a complete and total disgrace to these games and the people who worked hard to see them released. I'll be the first to say that I personally dislike certain other bosses more than I do Elden Beast. Maliketh and Malenia, as far as I'm concerned, are stains of cat piss and failures design-wise. And don't even get me started on some of those DLC bosses. But you will never catch me saying that Maliketh or Malenia are objectively worse than the Elden Beast, because saying that would be utterly fucking preposterous. Elden Beast was meant to serve as the reflection of all that FromSoft had worked to achieve with what is undeniably their biggest game ever, for better or worse. But instead it turned out to be a dysfunctional amalgamation of nearly every negative quality to be found in Elden Ring's many bosses that is so painstakingly bland and unengaging that I am sincerely convinced that this game released with this boss unfinished, and that FromSoft resolved to leave it unfinished until the release of the DLC because the game already turned out to be so financially lucrative, leaving them in a more than comfortable position to sit on any of the game's flaws until the big DLC release came about. And for what it's worth, it's a good looking boss. I understand that's subjective as hell, but I think it looks phenomenal personally, and hey, the OST is pretty damn great. But otherwise, there are pretty much no redeeming factors to speak of with the Elden Beast whatsoever. Mechanically speaking, Elden Beast is fucking huge, as is the boss arena, which might very well be the largest arena in the entire game, barring maybe Radagon's. Furthermore, the Elden Beast can move quite fast and almost immediately create large gaps between itself and the player thanks to its ability to fly, swim, and even teleport. Do you see the problem here? This kind of mobility does not function well in such a massive arena if the player cannot keep up. Naturally, this is exactly the kind of reason that Torrent exists, to help speed the player up so they can close the more vast gaps between themselves and their objective. Unfortunately, FromSoft, I guess, forgot to enable Torrent in this fight. I say forgot because I refuse to believe that anyone working at this studio is actually so stupid that they legitimately never once considered implementing Torrent into this fight. Furthermore, it makes all too much sense to be able to use such a core mechanic that has otherwise been locked off from the majority of other bosses in this particular event, given it's the game's last and final boss. Hey guys, Future Loveless here, and I come bearing good news. As of the launch for Shadow of the Erdtree, FromSoft has finally patched Torrent into the Elden Beast fight. It only took 2 fucking years, but they finally brought this fight to the staggering heights of being marginally less smelly diarrhea. Thank you, FromSoft. Very cool. The Elden Beast possesses a colossal sword which is capable of dealing very high damage to the point that dodging is pretty much your only option, even if you're disconnected from this thing by several meters. And as if that wasn't enough, it can also cast energy waves and generate AoEs, because of course it can. The Elden Beast even has a selection of combos to help it punish the player for even approaching it, which you will have to do several times, likely taking quite a while to do so each time, given just how far out this thing can retreat, and not to mention its massive health pool, which affords it many opportunities to do so. The Elden Beast also has a command grab, because of course it does.
I am so sick of you.
But perhaps even more obnoxious are the Elden Beast's magic attacks, which include homing rings that close in around you and try to stagger lock you into a powerful explosion, a rain of energy beams that will either be easy to avoid if you have a good amount of stamina on you at the time, or borderline impossible not to die to if it casts while you have especially low stamina. Hey, thank God they patched in Torrent, now you can actually dodge this attack pretty consistently. That feels pretty good, doesn't it? There's also the Stardust Clouds with delayed explosions, although this is by far the easiest to avoid, Golden Fire Breath, which covers a pretty large area of effect, and of course, the infamous Elden Stars. Let's talk about this fucking thing, shall we? And before we get into it, yes, I know they patched in Torrent, it's a lot easier to avoid now, but you have to understand, I went through 2 years of this fucking thing being basically impossible to dodge, alright? I'm gonna bitch about it. Elden Stars is an incantation which sees the Elden Beast firing a homing projectile, which is not only faster than you, and persists for an inexcusably long time, but that projectile itself also fires its own homing projectiles by the dozen before finally exploding. I sincerely do not know if it is even possible to not take damage from this attack without having some way to completely bypass holy damage for a lengthy stretch of time, again not counting Torrent, unless we count the physic, which briefly turns damage taken into health restored, but that is hardly a justification. Bear in mind, the Elden Beast is free to do whatever it wants while this thing is going off, so while you're trying to escape the smothering of the Elden Stars, the Elden Beast could be doing anything from a massive sword combo to casting even more magic. I have fought this boss literally dozens of times at this point, and I have yet to find a way to completely avoid this attack altogether. I'm assuming that's just another one of those get good scenarios, isn't it?
Loveless, just Google how to dodge it.
You know, I gotta say, it's pretty tiring having to Google all this information that the game itself fails to convey. I alluded to it before, but Radagon really gets so much worse when you take into account the Elden Beast. Not even because of the spectacle or whatever, Radagon just feels like a prerequisite you have to mind-numbingly endure before each and every attempt at the Elden Beast. Could you seriously imagine if in Bloodborne you had to fight Gehrman every time you died to the Moon Presence? Not only would it be a distractingly bad case of ludonarrative dissonance, but it would turn Gehrman from one of the game's best bosses, no, one of the studio's best bosses, into a downright chore. Dark Souls 2 doesn't even have a good final boss out of its selection, but even it understood that having to fight Throne Watcher and Defender so you could fight Nashandra again so you could fight Aldia again would have been fucking terrible. I find it insulting just how impossibly bad the Elden Beast is, and regardless of my feelings towards Elden Ring as a whole, it could have at least mitigated the frustration by closing the game out on a satisfying note. Sadly, this wasn't meant to be, and Elden Ring's closing moments are a sour blend of frustration and disappointment that sullies the experience that, again, despite my frustrations, meant a great deal to many people, myself included. What an absolute fucking disgrace. And with the Elden Beast torn so unapologetically to shreds, it is time for the moment I am sure many of you have been waiting for.
I dreamt for so long. My flesh was dull gold, and my blood rotted. Corpse after corpse left in my wake. As I awaited his return. Heed my words. I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella. And I have never known defeat.
Well, we're finally here. You all knew this was coming. You all knew we would get here eventually. This is Malenia, the undefeated Blade of Miquella and goddess of the accursed Scarlet Rot. And to be perfectly honest, I can't even be mad about this boss. I'm just disappointed. Disappointed that the character whose statue I received with my collector's edition of this game could be so canonically badass, and yet so poorly realized on a mechanical level. Disappointed that the boss which would inevitably come to define Elden Ring would be the very embodiment of the design problems that surface throughout many boss fights. Disappointed that after all these games have worked to achieve, this is the end result. Well, prior to the DLC, that is. But perhaps what I find most disappointing of all is that Malenia is so close. She is so close to being a genuinely great boss, but because FromSoft downright refused to pump the brakes and recognize when enough was enough, Malenia, Blade of Miquella, turned out to be the game's most defining boss for all the wrong reasons. Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, is known for being hard, and yep, she sure is. If you want to refer to her as the hardest boss ever, at least prior to the DLC, be my fucking guest. I know difficulty is subjective, but you would be hard-pressed to claim any other boss in this game prior to the DLC comes even close to the difficulty of Malenia. If ever there were an example of a boss in Elden Ring's base game that was designed with the sole intent of being as impossibly hard as the developer can manage, Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is that boss. It is abundantly clear that they wanted her to be Elden Ring's pinnacle challenge. Again, before the DLC. Malenia, Blade of Miquella has everything, and I mean everything at her disposal. Calling this fight skewed would honestly be underselling it. Her damage output is absolutely outrageous. Her combos sometimes never even seem to have an end to them. Her area coverage almost completely blankets the entire arena. Her punish windows are absurdly slim and sometimes even deceitful, albeit plentiful once you learn them. Her telegraphing is extremely brief for all but her two most powerful attacks. She has the power of God and anime on her side. Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, really is the embodiment of Elden Ring's design philosophy cranked to absolute absurdity. The first issue that many are likely to notice but not quite grasp is the strange rhythm of her attacks. Malenia has a frankly bizarre mix of speed, tracking, and delays in certain attacks that feel as if they are designed specifically to throw you off. Many of her telegraphs look alike, or require you to discern the exact length of time at which she's performing the windup so as to determine her next move and how to avoid it. Furthermore, certain combos come out so rapidly that you will literally need to preemptively dodge one attack in a way that allows you enough time to avoid the follow-up attack. I hope I don't need to tell you just how frustrating and inconsistent it can feel to be punished for not being able to think multiple steps ahead against a boss this fast and oftentimes unpredictable.
But I'm not done yet!
Some of you are likely wondering if Malenia can be parried. After all, a humanoid foe wielding a sword makes sense to be able to parry. Plus, it would be nice to have a consistent method of punishing the boss, even if it would require regular use of a high-risk playstyle. Thankfully, the answer is yes. She can be parried, but also no. See, here's the thing. You can actually parry Malenia. Unfortunately, if you were hoping to get a riposte from it, you know, an actual reward for this risky play, you're going to need to parry her 2 more times. Because parrying her doesn't actually function as a parry so much as a dedicated stance break. This has to be one of the most artificial ways of inflating a boss's difficulty that I have ever come across, right up there with Maliketh's Destined Death. Hey, Earth to the people who've been designing these games with this mechanic since 2009. In case you weren't aware of it, parrying is already a high-risk technique to try and apply to a battle, let alone a fight against a boss with as much speed and damage output as Malenia. The risk of punish and the skill floor to land even a single successful parry on her are already extremely high, so making it to where she will only open up for a riposte after a whopping 3 parries is absolute nonsense. Either include the mechanic properly or don't include it at all. This is not the middle ground that I'm sure you thought it would be. Not only does this triple the risk of the player taking a lot of damage, in some cases potentially fatal damage from multiple hits in a row, just for trying to land a single punish, but this also means putting yourself at major risk of letting Malenia heal herself. Because for some reason or another, FromSoft decided that Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, also gets the benefit of healing herself every time she attacks the player. Well, okay, that's actually not entirely accurate. You see, the thing to understand about Malenia the Blade of Miquella's healing is that it isn't vampiric by design. She doesn't actually feed off your health, she just feeds off the impact of her sword. All that Malenia the Blade of Miquella needs to do is connect with an attack and she will heal from it. You can be completely blocking all of her attacks, but she will still heal from attacking you no matter what, as long as her attacks connect with some part of you or your summons. However much damage she does or does not inflict isn't even a factor in whether or not she gets to heal. This completely invalidates shields and borders on invalidating spirit ashes altogether. Blocking her is already risky because of her sheer speed, damage, and ferocity, even with great shields, but the fact that she actually gets to heal off of these attacks basically renders shields into an active handicap to even try and use against her. Considering half the appeal of this game is the player freedom and build variety, this would seem to run rather counterintuitive to one of the core design philosophies of this game, would it not? Again, I understand not every build is going to be especially effective against every single boss, but you would think that one of the most defining bosses of the game would allow, in some capacity, for you to utilize every other mechanic without being severely handicapped. Then there's Spirit Ashes, and while I wouldn't say they're outright invalidated, at least not to the same degree as shields, the fact that the AI is as bad as dodging as it is can lead to some extremely frustrating moments where the summon is basically just feeding Malenia's health. What's worse, she can even heal by attacking Spirit Ashes and summons after they have already died. I hope I don't need to explain why that is complete bullshit. As far as her moveset goes, her more basic sword swipes, lunges, and stabs are pretty straightforward. If anything, they actually kinda remind me of Lady Maria. She has a couple of combos, a guard breaking hit, a helm breaker, a stinger. You can pretty effectively gauge these kinds of attacks just by looking at her, and there's little about her basic moveset to actively criticize. I should also note that her hitboxes are, at least more often than not, pleasantly airtight. Like, impressively so. However, one attack that I'm not as tolerant of would have to be her grab. Malenia the Blade of Miquella's grab is really finicky, and there's two reasons for this. The first is the telegraph. Not only is it really fast, but the actual animation is deceptively similar to her forward lunging animations, like when she's about to use her stinger or the uppercut. It might seem easy to spot the difference when watching the video or if you've played the game enough times, but in the heat of battle when you're actively trying to think ahead and manage your health, magic, stamina, equipped weapon, and so on, this kind of split-second animation can really throw you off if you happen to read it wrong.
Loveless, that sounds like a skill issue you really need to get good.
Hey, yeah, fuck off.
The second issue with her grab is the tracking. Malenia the Blade of Miquella has a major problem with tracking the player to the ends of the cosmos, but it is really noticeable here. I said a while back that Elden Ring's smaller and more humanoid bosses rarely look bad when they track, at least while they're on the ground. For the most part, you won't really notice this kind of thing because your brain just shrugs it off as an adjustment of footing or the enemy using the sheer force of their swing to turn their body. Not here though, and given the sheer degree of of punish, it can be pretty damn frustrating to get caught when it looks as if the game is so blatantly going out of its way to kill you. It's important to remember, this is Elden Ring's late game. Malenia's grab does enormous damage and heals her for a massive amount of health. Getting hit once pretty much guarantees that you'll need to heal, so when an attack this powerful connects in such a cartoonish way, it can really feel like the game is just going out of its way to screw you out of a valuable resource. Perhaps the one saving grace about Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, is the fact that her health bar is pretty small compared to most of Elden Ring's late game. The fact that she heals is really obnoxious, but if your damage is high enough, it will only get her so much back. And hey, for what it's worth, she can also be staggered, which itself will open her up to further punish if you're able to coordinate your attacks well enough. Obviously, you'll need a thorough understanding of her moveset and not to mention your own to pull this off, but at this point in the game, if you're not familiar with your own moveset, then frankly it's a miracle you made it this far. Unfortunately, her phase 2 has its own health bar, and while it's not especially large, this kind of thing just really annoys me at this point. I want to acknowledge that this is completely subjective. I'm not trying to pass off the in-game super boss having a second health bar as an objective flaw. However, I think there is still a nugget of a point worth tackling here. For the most part, FromSoft has a pretty good track record for not going too crazy with bosses having multiple health bars. For the most part, they're pretty rare, and when they do appear, there's usually a clear purpose, and it's usually to achieve a certain effect. Sister Fried, for instance, had 3 health bars, however, none of them were particularly big, and the second phase gave you 2 enemies which shared that 1 health bar. As hard as Sister Fried is, the health bars are never really an issue, and it was genuinely surprising when it happened. Soul of Cinder would be another boss with a second health bar. However, that second health bar has about 2/3 the health of the first, and it was more about the fact that it was channeling Gwen in its dying moments. This was an effective moment, even for more casual fans of the series, and overall it was just a brilliant wrap-up to the story of Dark Souls. As far as Elden Ring is concerned, the only other bosses besides Malenia, the Blade of Miquella with multiple health bars were Rennala, Rykard, and Radagon in the Elden Beast. Even the DLC made it a point to avoid multiple health bars on all but pretty much one boss, and that one was optional. Rennala is kinda weird, narratively speaking, since you don't actually kill her even though you do get her remembrance, and with Rykard you were fighting the Serpent first, with Rykard only awakening when the situation proved dire. It was essentially a second entity within the same body, and the body itself is canonically ever regenerating. For Radagon and the Elden Beast, they are obviously 2 separate entities, so that obviously checks out. These bosses all had a certain spectacle factor to them that I would imagine is fairly obvious. Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, retains the spectacle factor, but there's nothing about this second phase transition which seems to have any sort of intended effect other than the typical, this is where the real boss fight begins, which is already an idea present in plenty of other bosses just within this game. Anyone familiar with Elden Ring's lore will know of Malenia and Radagon's battle, and how Malenia awakened her goddess form to defeat Radagon and his army. Beyond that, did anyone seriously believe that the in-game super boss, even if you are the most casual of casual fans, was only going to have one phase? I mean, seriously? Regardless, Malenia, the Blade of Miquella's second phase is, as far as a transformative state goes, probably at the level of Godric in that it basically enhances her first phase while adding in a couple of new attacks.
Wait. The scarlet bloom flowers once more. You will witness true,
her already colossal damage is magnified further. Her behavior is comparatively far more aggressive, so if you thought that her first phase was rough, you have seen nothing yet. There are two new moves in particular that can be extremely devastating if they manage to connect. The first of these attacks sees her flying upwards to a position that you won't be able to punish her from without some form of ranged attacks, which itself needs to be pretty fast. From here, Malenia will fire out a handful of phantoms to attack the player before finally coming down with a massive stinger. These phantoms will go for their own slashes, stingers, helm splitters, so on and so forth. They deal extremely high damage, but more importantly, they reveal a significant issue with Malenia's second phase, that being her wings. Malenia's wings are downright cluttered with what must be hundreds of actively animated details. The sheer volume of butterflies and particle effects can often make reading her attacks more difficult than it really should be, because now you also have to try and catch the various nuances in her animations through this mass of scarlet butterflies, which blend very easily with both the arena and Malenia's various rotted details. It's also worth noting that these wings don't always look fantastic themselves, at least with how they animate, with Malenia's wings awkwardly pointed straight up her back, despite how her body may sometimes be bending or twisting, both from her own attacks as well as stagger received from player attacks. I don't know, it's one of those things that once you see it, you can't really unsee it. The second of these attacks is an AoE dive bomb where she flies once again into the sky before going out of her way to hone in on the player as she comes crashing down. Not only is this attack difficult to dodge without what is essentially an AI exploit where you go beneath her and force her tracking to fire her off in another direction, but she will always start the second phase of the fight already suspended and ready for the dive bomb. I hope I don't really need to explain this, but it can make for a very cheap gotcha moment which serves no other purpose than to frustrate the player and cheapen the initial phase 2 transition even further. When she lands, a massive scarlet flower petal will erupt from Malenia, dealing absurdly high damage and dealing moderate damage over time to those within its range over the next few seconds, all the while simultaneously afflicting Scarlet Rot. Scarlet Rot is one of the game's most potent status afflictions, so having it be inflicted in the latter portions of a fight this difficult can feel a bit extreme, though for what it's worth, the build-up is far from instantaneous, meaning unlike most other punishments in Malenia the Blade of Miquella's fight, this one is pretty definitively on the player should they happen to find themselves afflicted. It's a method for preventing greedy punish off a seemingly highly punishable attack, but not to the point of outright negation, so that's definitely appreciated. If anything, it feels more like an opportunity to gather your bearings, which in a fight like this was desperately needed. Plus, for what it's worth, ranged players can take full advantage of all this time that she spends planted in that position. Get it? This is great, but also doesn't change the fact that Malenia's sheer aggression and area coverage will typically invalidate this kind of playstyle for the majority of the fight. But at the very least, sorcerers will have more than just ranged castings to take advantage of by this point in the game, so, you know, that's something. And I guess with all of that, now it's time for me to finally talk about it. You already know, we are now going to talk about Waterfowl Dance. Let's start with the animation itself. Waterfowl Dance is probably the most highly telegraphed attack in the entirety of Elden Ring, which might seem like a blessing initially, but the fact that Elden Ring is actually giving you such a confidently large window to anticipate an attack should be all the tell you need to understand what's about to happen is going to be extremely punishing. The telegraph for Waterfowl Dance sees Malenia leaping into the air and holding her position, completely defying gravity as her character model, despite not even being in motion, turns to maintain a lock on your position for the duration of the charge up. So she has yet to even swing her sword, and already this attack has problems. Beyond the visual of her character model turning both horizontally and vertically depending on your position, the extent of her lock onto you conveys with rather abundant transparency that this attack is meant to kill you at all costs. FromSoft really wants you to know that this attack is among the strongest in the game, and they could not care less about how ridiculous it looks. Nor do they care just how obviously they're skewing the fight in favor of the enemy. It's as if they've completely abandoned any notion of designing their game to be even remotely fair and just want it to be known that they made a really hard boss. I really want you guys to pay attention to this wind-up. It's hard to pay critical mind to this kind of thing in the midst of an intense boss battle, but seriously, look at just how blatantly she's been locked on to the player's position. It is fascinating to me just how blatant FromSoft was with this particular wind-up. After the initial initial windup, Malenia the Blade of Miquella will blitz towards the player with a flurry of slashes that encompass her character model completely, all the while turning even in the middle of her dash so as to ensure she strikes as close to the player as possible. The tracking is at its all-time worst with this particular part of Waterfowl Dance, because to this day there are only two fairly reliable ways of avoiding taking damage from this first dash, neither of which you'll likely be able to intuit without some sort of tip or just googling a straight up guide. And yes, you heard me correctly, there actually exists guides solely for dodging this one specific attack. It really is that bad. It is honestly incredible to me that FromSoft went so far out of their way to convey just how bullshit their attack is, but couldn't be bothered to try and actually convey a means of avoiding or otherwise defending yourself against said attack. But you know, I guess that's the result of prioritizing sheer difficulty over balanced design. Right? Anyway, the first method for avoiding this first dash is to simply run away. That might seem kind of obvious, but you have to understand that this is really only doable if you're already at a notable distance from Malenia and you've managed to read the attack. If you try running from a close range, guess what? You're dead. Most likely off this one dash alone. It is possible to outrun with a head start, but you also need to have a fair amount of space in the direction you're running, otherwise you'll just hit a wall. Oh my god, could you imagine if Malenia the Blade of Miquella healed just by hitting walls? I mean, she can heal off of shields and corpses, so hey, why not at this point?
Oh, come on, Loveless. You and I both know that would be unfair bullshit.
Haha, that sounds like a skill issue to me. Why don't you try getting good? The second means of avoiding the Waterfowl Dance's first dash is to run at a slight angle directly beneath Malenia, Blade of Miquella, basically wrestling with the positioning of her character model so as to trick the AI into firing off in a different direction. Were you to stand still beneath Malenia, she would still drop just shy of your position, with the remainder of her tracking pulling her model towards you. However, by maintaining your movement while effectively remaining in the same position, you can trick her AI into thinking you're about to move further out than you intend, causing her to fly off momentarily in another direction. Do I seriously need to explain why this is so mind-numbingly stupid? The single most reliable method for dodging the first phase of this attack, because even attacks have phases now apparently, isn't even a coordinated or well-timed dodge or anything like that. It's just a tactic for exploiting the AI that the majority of people would never even guess were it not for the plethora of guides dedicated to this single attack. I honestly want to know if this was even playtested, because it feels like there is a genuine chance that this might not be the case. I suppose it's also worth noting that it is possible with an especially strong shield and stamina to block this initial onslaught, and really any phase of Waterfowl, but yeah, so about that healing, do you really want to be fighting more of this, especially when she can just use Waterfowl multiple times in a row anyways? The second phase of Waterfowl Dance sees Malenia the Blade of Miquella hurling herself towards the player yet again. If you pay close enough attention, you'll notice that she has less attacks with this one, and her range is similarly decreased, albeit slightly. There's a pretty unanimous consensus among players that this one is best dodged by rolling through it, because trying to dodge away from it will most likely see you still winding up inside the Slash Bubbles hitbox as your iframes expire. You can run or roll away to escape it if there's still enough of a gap between you and Malenia, Blade of Miquella. However, that's going to be a lot less likely given just how much of an area is covered by the first phase of her attack. And that's pretty much all I have to say regarding the Waterfowl Dance's second phase. It's a pretty simple but not too overpowered rush of about 3 attacks that, while heavy on the punish, is thankfully not too difficult to avoid either. The hitbox is unfortunately still this obnoxious bubble of anime slash effects that don't even line up with her movement, but it's comparatively passable, unlike Waterfowl's first and third phase. Unfortunately, phase 3 of Waterfowl is about on par with the first in that the number of attacks, the sheer range, and of course the tracking are all cranked back up to 11. I want to start by emphasizing the tracking here because it is honestly atrocious. Malenia the Blade of Miquella's character model will make a total of 3 turns so as to hone in on you, the first being as she initiates the final dash, the second being at about the halfway point of the dash, and finally once more as she's ending the combo. I'm willing to give the initial turn a pass because logically her character is lunging towards the tarnish for one more attack, and it wouldn't make much sense for her to go from standing still to firing off in the wrong direction, but that second turn is honestly embarrassing, and the last one had a very particular purpose that I'll get to shortly. The second turn, yes, we're even talking about the turns within the phases of the attacks, is easily one of the potentially sharpest that she can make, and it honestly looks ridiculous when single synced with the actual animation that she's performing. I really want you to watch this. Look at how her character model twists and contorts just to try and keep up with where it is that she's supposed to be going and what it is her AI is actually doing. This is the kind of thing that really annoys me about this game. Even putting aside the fact that it's clearly only there to artificially inflate the difficulty, the animation itself is distractingly bad as a result. I know that not very many people will even catch this kind of detail, but I can't help but notice it given just how many times I've been forced to watch this godforsaken attack play out, and I simply can't unsee it. And since I can't unsee it, I'm opting to bless you with this curse knowledge as well. You're welcome. The final turn of this phase of the attack comes at the tail end of the flurry, with its only mechanical effect seemingly being to help Malenia face the player immediately following the attack. That might not seem like an issue, but it's important to remember that for Malenia, time spent turning towards the player could be time spent attacking, so it's apparent that this was only done so as to eliminate Malenia's downtime following this already ultra powerful attack, which itself ends with a delayed AoE. As you've probably surmised, this AoE pretty much only exists so as to eradicate whatever punish window might have once existed with this attack. So pretty much the only possible way of actually punishing Waterfowl without in turn being punished for punishing her is if you somehow manage to be off to the side of or even behind Malenia the Blade of Miquella as she is finishing the Waterfowl Dance and run in for an attack after the AoE triggers. Given just how slim this window is, you're unlikely to land more than a single attack, maybe 2 or even 3 if you get a bit greedy and also have enough stagger and proper timing. It is worth noting that casters and range players do get a fairly generous punish window, but that's about as good as it's going to get for them given the majority of the fight they're just going to be dodging and running away. On the subjective side of things, I honestly think the attack itself it looks ridiculous. And to be clear, it's not even just the tracking. Malenia's movements don't actually line up with the slash effects that appear around her, and that last AoE in particular is just, God, it is dripping with an insufferable nothing personnel energy. I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella, nothing personnel tarnished. Maliketh would be so proud. Actually, wait, isn't she blind? Why is she trying to look cool? In all seriousness, her motion not lining up with the effect makes it difficult to gauge what exactly is even happening, or what it is that's even really hitting you to begin with, and not to mention just how many times you're being hit. This sort of goes away with time, but when an ultra-powerful move is so hard to reliably interpret the function of, it makes dying to it over and over feel really cheap and honestly just hopeless. Conveying boss mechanics should have been a priority for attacks this powerful, because it feels like FromSoft really wanted the players to be blindsided as frequently as possible. Again, prioritizing difficulty over literally everything else. I mean, I guess it does help to build the game and Malenia the Blade of Miquella's reputation for being super hard, but I can't imagine I'm alone in saying that I'm no longer interested in seeing FromSoft try and one-up themselves and be as hard as possible to prove their games are the hardest possible. I just want the game to be good. I would take Malenia the Blade of Miquella being the easiest boss in Elden Ring, but an absolute blast to fight, versus the bright neon sign saying, hey, this game is hard that this boss is trying to be. It's mind-numbingly excessive, and given just how much of that already exists in Elden Ring, the whole charade has just grown stale for me at this point. Maybe some of you disagree, maybe you love it, and hey look, it's fine, but hopefully you can at least see where I'm coming from. There's also the issue of when Malenia the Blade of Miquella is even allowed to use this mechanic. Her AI is supposedly coded not to use it until her health hits the 70% mark, and while I appreciate that she can't just start the fight with it, because God help me, that would be pretty fucking stupid, don't you think? This does feel rather arbitrary. The 50% mark would have at least felt more in line with these sub-phase mechanics like Radagon's AoEs and Renala's summoning, but I guess with Malenia the Blade of Miquella, they wanted her to be able to do it as early as possible without the possibility of being able to trigger it within the opening seconds of the fight, because hey, we just gotta show the player how hard this fight is as soon as possible. But honestly, I'm not even sure if that logic tracks. It's important to remember that the health pool for Malenia the Blade of Miquella is far from the game's largest, so knocking off that first 30% or so of her health isn't really that difficult for anyone dealing the kind of damage that you would be expecting to deal at this point in the game. And again, Malenia heals off of these attacks, so if she were to land a Waterfowl Dance at this level of health, she would almost Dance definitely get herself back up to around the 90% mark, almost as likely as you would be hitting the 0% mark were she to land that many hits off of it. I also want to take this opportunity to debunk something that I have constantly heard about Malenia, the Blade of Miquella. A lot of people seem to be under the impression that Malenia can't use Waterfowl Dance more than once in a row, and that there's a cooldown to her ability to use it so as to keep her AI in check. However, that is simply not true. So here's a clip of her doing it twice in a row.
Another one.
Well, Loveless, that's clearly just a momentary bug in her AI, so that doesn't count.
Okay, alright. Now here's Malenia doing Waterfowl Dance 3 times in a row.
Well, Loveless, that also doesn't count because you were using Spirit Ashes, so your argument's invalid. Get good. Skill issue, you didn't play the game right anyways.
Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, can use Waterfowl Dance multiple times in a row. And I hope that I don't need to tell you that is fucking dumb as hell. Like I said, it really doesn't feel as though this attack was properly playtested, but then again, that might be because this attack wasn't actually finished until really late in development. Waterfowl Dance actually used to look a lot different. In fact, I actually think the original animation was pretty damn solid. It's hard to say without being able to play against her using this attack myself, but from what I can tell, it looks like it would be comparatively far more manageable than the current iteration. It's disappointing to see that this attack got so little time in the oven because I feel like with a bit of fine-tuning, it could have turned out to be a really memorable part of this boss. You know, for the right reasons. Then there's the Waterfowl Dance used by Malenia's Phase 2, the Goddess of Rot. The hitbox is bigger, there's a lot more dynamic visual effects happening, the damage is increased, and she even applies Scarlet Rot with each attack, because of course she does. I honestly don't even think it's necessary at this point to get into why this can be, yeah, it's a bit much. Yeah, it's a bit much. In all honesty, and this isn't even just with her Phase 2, there are times where you're gonna recognize the moment that she's jumping into the air that you are literally not going to be able to escape death, and you just have to accept it. If you're mid-animation, low on stamina, or even just at the wrong distance, you might as well put your controller down. So congratulations, FromSoft, you did it. You made the harderest, bossest everest. Unfortunately, you put so much time and effort into making sure that she was as impossibly hard as you could possibly manage, that you forgot to polish and balance her to the point of being able to justify the immense pressure this level of difficulty puts on the mechanics. And it's a shame because, like I said, with a handful of frankly simple changes, dialing those damage and tracking sliders back, turning off her ability to heal from hitting shields and already dead players, and of course either deleting or drastically modifying Waterfowl Dance, Malenia could have been one seriously incredible boss. But as it stands, the only thing Malenia will ever be known for is being hard. Some people will occasionally talk about the cool lore, maybe the magnificent OST, but could you even have a serious conversation about this boss without nearly every point in some way tying back to her exceptional difficulty? I sincerely doubt it. And since we all know there's gonna be that one elitist douchebag snob who complains about me using Spirit Ashes against Malenia for so many of the fights, no doubt right after they commented on a Reddit post praising the game for its build variety and sheer number of options, here is me beating Malenia solo with 2 different characters.
Well, Loveless, you were using Bleed and Frost, so those don't really count because those weapons are OP. Also, you play bad anyways, so I don't care.
Alright, weird considering Let Me Solo Her is probably the most beloved person in the entirety of the Elden Ring community aside from Miyazaki himself, and I guess maybe Vati, and he literally uses these exact same weapons, one of which was famously nerfed, multiple times, but alright, I'll grant you that. Now allow me to show you me beating her solo with the scythe and crossbow.
Well, Loveless, those also don't count because Bleed is meta and OP. Also, you're still bad at the game, lol. Skill issue, get good. Okay. Alright, now here's me beating Malenia on New Game Plus 2 with an Unga Bunga tanky strength build, dual-wielding Godric's Great Axe, a weapon that I know to be considered amongst the worst remembrance weapons by the community, and yes, I know I summoned for the first phase, but as you can see, it didn't survive the initial dive bomb of the phase 2, leaving me completely on my own, so I think that's fair to show. Well, Loveless, that also doesn't count because cope and seethe, you fucking malding nerds. Get over yourself. Anyways, I really wanted to like Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, and I mean that wholeheartedly. Her lore is so compelling. Her character is complex and tragic, but also not completely innocent either, especially after what we learned from the DLC. Her visual design is an easy 10 out of 10. Her OST is downright incredible. She has so much going for her outside of the boss itself. I don't think she's the worst boss in the game, but she is one of the worst, and for me a major letdown. I'm sure that some of you probably thought going into this that I just didn't like her because, she's too hard. And while my reasons are mostly to do with the balancing and difficulty of her fight, I hope that I've at least made it clear that my issues with her are nowhere near that superficial, as has been the case with the majority of my issues with this game. I love plenty of bosses that relative to their games are extremely challenging. Virgil in Devil May Cry 3, King Cerberus in Devil May Cry 5, Ludwig and the Orphan of Cause from Bloodborne, Sister Fried and Gale from Dark Souls 3, Armstrong in Metal Gear Rising on the max difficulty, Cynthia and Kieran from Pokemon, Sephiroth and the Unknown Hooded Man from Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, The Lingering Will in Organization 13 Remix fights in Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix, Yellow Devil from Mega Man, Elizabeth in Persona 3. I am not at all averted to an extremely difficult fight. Hell, I still haven't even beaten Elizabeth, and Persona 3 is my favorite game of all time. I know I'll get there eventually, but, you know, I have 1,000 other games to play, so cut me some fucking slack. Unfortunately, I still have more to talk about with Elden Ring and its bosses because there is one more major boss that I have yet to touch on. Yes, I know, this boss section is long enough as it is, believe me. I know, I'm the one making this shit. But this fight was the most important boss for me in all of Elden Ring, so I really need to talk about it. I'm speaking of none other than Rennala, the Queen of the Full Moon.
Hello? Oh god, it can't be. The Prowling Magus from Dark Souls 2. No. All these Catholic schoolboys are gonna want my ass kicked.
Hush, little Calva.
Ooh, that's a cool boss design.
I'll soon birth thee anew, a sweeting, fresh and pure.
Okay. I don't despise Renala, but I also can't help but blame her for being the catalyst for all my negativity that I feel towards Elden Ring. It could have been any number of other bosses depending on whereabouts I happened to venture in my first playthrough, but ultimately it was Renala that would come to define this game for myself personally, more so than Malenia, the Elden Beast, Placidusax, or even Godfrey. I fully intend to objectively judge this boss on its own merits, but I feel it's important for this boss especially to convey my subjective experience and the context for why I feel the way I do about it. She's far from the objectively worst boss in the game, but my experience with her is very much going to stay with me for however long it is that this game is on my mind. Prior to Elden Ring's release, I was pretty excited for it. I wasn't going crazy, but I was looking forward to it from the moment that it was announced. As the launch drew nearer, I was pretty excited, especially with how well it was reviewing and the general energy surrounding the community. I'd also not seen anything beyond the initial reveal trailer, so I was going in blind and with no expectations other than to find myself immersed in another fascinating world with lore to uncover, and of course exciting challenges to overcome. My opening hours with Elden Ring were kinda strange to say the least. I was getting very mixed signals with the game as far as its quality, with some aspects of the game really impressing me, like the character creation, artistic direction, the scale of the world, build potential, getting a horse, and so much more. Other aspects of the game, though, were giving me major Dark Souls 2 vibes, like the fact that I could tell minor enemies were being used for boss fights in minor dungeons, but I shrugged them off because they didn't feel too significant at the time. Raya Lucaria is where my time with the game really began to take a nosedive. And while I've already talked about Raya Lucaria and the Red Wolf of Radagon, Renala was very much the piece de resistance that solidified the game's turn from a fun new Souls successor into a game that I had honestly a terrible first experience with. It's important to understand that I was really excited to see Renala's boss fight, and for what it's worth, I think the surrounding area of Liurnia does a fantastic job of building up the lore of Raya Lucaria, as well as Renala and even Radagon's characters. I wasn't sure what to expect, knowing that Radagon had abandoned her, but it was obvious that I was going to be dealing with a very heartbroken character that also just so happened to be the most powerful sorceress in the lands between. Sorcerer bosses are also surprisingly scarce in From games, and they're typically not that impressive either, so I was really pulling for one that would break the mold and show me what this game was truly capable of as far as bosses and general creativity. And eventually I would come face to face with Renala. I found Renala's first phase pretty interesting, at least with my initial encounter. It was more or less an expansion on Pinwheel and even the Deacons of the Deep concept, which requires you to find 3 targets in a room of many and kill them so as to make Renala vulnerable. As much time as you're allotted between Renala's offense, she can actually deal some fairly high damage relative to that point in the game, so you need to use your time wisely. I had also deduced very quickly that there was no way this was going to be all there was to the fight, and I immediately recognized how tedious the first phase was going to be on replay were it to be a mandatory part of the fight every time. There's also very little in the ways of creative potential or freedom to the fight. It's a very rinse-repeat process that can wear thin even in a single attempt depending on how fast you're killing Renala. Made worse by the fact that her phase 1 and 2 don't share a health bar, meaning the first phase just goes on longer than it seems to deserve, again relative to the damage output you're likely to be dealing at that point in the game. If you decide to come back a lot later, well, yeah, Phase 1's gonna fly by, but that's not the average intended experience. By the time I'd reached Phase 2, I was starting to get pretty annoyed. It wasn't difficult so much as tedious, and I was starting to feel like I was getting a pretty firm understanding of the design philosophy behind this game. And I was really hoping that Renala's Phase 2 would be where things took a turn for the better, and for what it's worth, that Phase 2 cutscene, man. Oh? Okay. I'm assuming a cutscene is supposed to happen? Okay, there we go.
My beloved, have no fear. I will hold thee.
Oh my god.
Ye will be countless born, forever and ever.
What the fuck? Is there another phase?
Upon my name as Rani the Witch.
Oh.
Mother's rich slumber shall not be disturbed by thee. Foul trespasser.
Okay.
Send word far and wide. Of the last queen of Caria, Renala of the full moon.
Yo, that is sick! That is sick!
And the majesty of the night she conjureth.
Man, did that get me hyped. Then her second phase began, and I was actually kind of enjoying myself. The opening Kamehameha felt a bit excessive, but I was willing to shrug it off because of just how well telegraphed it was. In fact, all of her attacks felt pretty well telegraphed. Nothing came out as really unfair or cheap. The only attacks that felt notably hard to dodge were the attacks with her scepter, but even they weren't that bad. She has a wide enough variety in her attacks, but she also never lacks for consistency either. I also appreciated the fact that there was a recognizable and logically coherent pattern to the behavior of her AI, and it didn't feel unnatural either. Renala is a sorceress. She's far from the tankiest boss, and she can even be staggered with heavy enough attacks. Because of this, she prioritizes widening the gap between herself and the player so as to be able to safely fire off her more powerful sorceries. She's by no means lacking in close-range offense, but it's clear that she specializes in ranged offense. There's this sort of cat-and-mouse energy to chasing her down, but she doesn't constantly widen the gap instantaneously like Gwendolyn or even the Elden Beast. If I'm being honest, Renala's Phase 2 started out pretty strong. Nothing felt excessive or blatant in its design, her behaviors made sense, her attacks were strong but never unfair. The arena and OST are among the best in the game. I was primed to label her my favorite boss up to that point. Then I got to her Phase 2's Phase 2. This game almost had me. This boss was so close. Just when all seemed to be right in the world and I was beginning to truly enjoy myself. Renala plants her scepter in the water, blowing me away and casting a summoning spell. And this, right here, ladies and gentlemen, this is the exact moment, down to the frame, that Elden Ring crushed me.
Whoa! What the fuck? That's a Sekiro enemy. What? But she could just summon a second boss like that? What the fuck?
Oh god. A fucking what? She can summon a dragon? What the shit? No. What the? She could just summon a dragon. Just like that. And it deals a shit ton of damage, and it appears to track me also. Thank god I had slow recovery on that. Holy shit. I don't know what to do about this. I got nothing. She could just summon this big fucking boss tier enemy. Okay, wow, that's really fucking cheap. That's so cheap. That's so cheap. I can't do anything about that. I have no way of beating this boss if she can just do that. Here comes another one. Oh my god, are you serious? Fuck that. Fuck everything about that. I do not like a boss having the ability to summon a fucking boss itself. Fucking Ilana the Squalid Queen bullshit. Oh my god. No, that... way to ruin the fucking fight. Way to absolutely fucking ruin the fight. That's... really bullshit. That is such horseshit. My enjoyment has been completely just shat on. Summoning a fucking boss. That is so stupid. Why the fuck would you... Like, summoning the one, you know, fucking Gale wannabe enemy. Like, fine. Whatever, it's annoying, but fine. Summoning a goddamn dragon that can nearly one-shot me? Fuck you. Because, like, it's a fucking dragon, its attacks are gonna cover the whole goddamn arena. On top of having to deal with her million homing projectiles. Fuck that. Yes. Raya Lucaria, I don't enjoy thee at all. I hate this fucking area so much. I legitimately fucking hate this fucking area. Oh my god. As Renala's health hits the 50% mark, or somewhere around that range, she'll proceed to cast a summoning spell to call upon one of 4 spirits. A pack of wolves, a Bloodhound Knight, which is basically a D-tier knockoff of Artorias and Gale, a Troll, which of course deals high damage and covers a decent area of effect, and an actual fucking dragon. Bear in mind, this summon cannot be broken via stagger, at least to my knowledge, and there is quite literally no room for punish because of the knockback. Yeah, you can dodge through it, but first of all, the dodge window is extremely slim, and second of all, you now have another enemy to worry about attacking you, and they all deal pretty substantial damage. There are few things in video games anymore that can seriously, genuinely piss me off beyond a brief moment of, what the fuck? Most of the time when I encounter some frustrating bullshit, I'll either just shrug it off or say some hyperbolic shit to try and make the moment at least funny, but hey, I'm not immune to getting mad. No one is. I get pretty damn pissed from time to time, typically when I just feel like my time is being wasted, like with COD Zombies Easter eggs, or a teammate doing something incomprehensibly stupid in a game where I'm supposed to be relying on them, but unless I'm tired or getting hungry, I'm pretty chill anymore when it comes to video games. So when I tell you that this was one of the only times Elden Ring left me genuinely seething with rage, I would hope that you could at least understand, knowing just how much I wanted to like this game and honestly still wish I could, even after all that I've criticized it for, why I might find it frustrating when this already plenty tough boss that I was having a great time with was suddenly, without so much as a glint of a window of punish, able to summon multiple boss tier enemies and an entire mob of one of From's worst designed enemies since the days of Demon Souls. Oh, and let's not forget, she can do this quite literally whenever she wants. I have had to deal with multiple summons at once alongside Renala, which, I gotta say, was pretty fucking frustrating and not to mention just plain discouraging. Even Ilana, the squalid queen from the Crown of the Sunken King who was capable of summoning Velstadt, knew there had to be some kind of limit to her summoning. Her summons took time to cast and didn't just knock the player on their ass to prevent punish. There was a very real opportunity to strike back against her because the reward for being able to summon additional enemies, let alone boss tier enemies, was obviously a significant advantage for the boss to possess. Make no mistake, I am not saying Ilana is a good boss. She is not. She is fucking terrible. But the fact that I can say a Dark Souls 2 DLC boss wasn't as bad in regards to a gank boss is pretty fucking embarrassing, to put it mildly. What's worse is that even when Renala is killed, her summons will remain active until the cutscene is finally initiated and you're brought back to Raya Lucaria. This was such a monumental disappointment of a boss for me personally. Raya Lucaria was bad enough, but for the capstone challenge of the dungeon to have such a monotonous first phase and a second phase that was practically perfect only for it to blindside me with a single mechanic that utterly ruined the fight was really fucking discouraging to say the least. This would also serve as something of a trend with Elden Ring, again for myself, with so many things seeming to have potential only for some one element to ruin them. Malenia, the Blade of Miquella, has other issues, but wouldn't be nearly as bad were it not for Waterfowl Dance. Radagon was alright, but then they lazily stapled AoEs onto all of his attacks and decided to call it a day. Estelle was honestly great, then he just showed up again for no reason in a random dungeon. The Ancestor Spirit was one of my personal favorite bosses, then the Regal Ancestor Spirit got that stupid AoE in that dumb little roll. Like, why, game? Godfrey is amazing, but is forever damaged by the Golden Spirit fight appearing completely out of nowhere. Godric is great. Then you get Godfroy. This pattern of it's great, but then this happens is such a frustratingly common occurrence with Elden Ring's bosses, and I hope to God that it doesn't become a persistent thing in future titles from this studio. So that was Elden Ring's bosses. Or at least the ones I felt like talking about, and oh dear mother of God, I was not expecting it to go on quite this long. At the very least, I can promise you guys that no other part of this critique is going to be anywhere near as lengthy as this one, barring probably the Shadows of the Erdtree DLC, since that's essentially going to be a whole mini critique of the expansion, which itself seems like it's pretty massive. But in the meantime, I hope you found my dissection of Elden Ring's bosses to be more enjoyable and informative. I know I got pretty damn negative at times, but I hope none of you felt off-put by it, and even if you personally enjoyed the bosses I didn't, I hope you can at least understand my criticisms towards them. Look, I know I can be hard on this game, but I'm not here to antagonize people. Unless you're a Maliketh fan. The next section will be the final summation of Elden Ring's design philosophy regarding difficulty and the end result of From Software's work. This will of course be the final section of the critique dedicated specifically to gameplay, after which we'll be looking into the much more artistically inclined side of the game, much of which I actually have quite a lot of praise for, so hey, there's something for you to look forward to. Okay, but seriously, how the fuck is Maliketh in two places at once, and how did he even get to Farum Azula? Actually, how did we get to Farum Azula? Like, no, seriously, what is it that transports us there? We just kind of show up after the Erdtree gets lit on fire. I don't even think Melina references taking us there, and it's possible to not even have Melina there to begin with, so I'm just confused. I mean, I guess that's why Vadi exists, but still, what the fuck?